inertia, which Sean Drummond also talked about in his lecture, followed by a fairly consistent high level of alertness through the waking day, a slight increase prior to the sleep episode, but then a rapid decline in alertness levels, and a consolidated period of nocturnal sleep. Now, this is regulated by these two processes, the circadian drive for wakefulness and the homeostatic drive for sleep, which oppose one another and give you, the interaction of the two gives you this state. So what happens then in shift work? Typically, the major change, firstly, is the period of wakefulness has now drastically changed. For example, for a night shift worker, there is now a period of wakefulness which has altered in its temporal pattern. Similarly, the period of sleep has now drastically changed as well. So in a shift worker, you have the circadian clock continues to show an increased pattern of alertness throughout the day, and this makes it difficult for the person to have a consolidated bout of sleep during the day. And so one of the most common complaints in a shift worker is that even though I'm sleepy and I try and go to sleep, and I want to sleep for 6 to 8 hours, I wake up after 4 hours. And the reason for that is that the circadian clock is increasingly sending a signal to promote alertness. And homeostatic sleep pressure is quite low as well. And so you then, as the person wakes up, typically from a fragmented sleep and a short sleep episode, homeostatic sleep pressure continues to build. And if the person is working at this time of the day here through the night, what happens? We have high homeostatic sleep pressure and the low circadian alertness signal combine to make it very challenging for shift workers, because they have to remain awake and alert and productive through this time. So I'm going to talk about work that we've been doing in shift workers, and I want to just spend a moment thinking about who are shift workers. Because sometimes we imagine when we say shift worker that the person is working in a factory, looking at a conveyor belt. But actually, a number of professions, and probably an increasing number of professions, are doing some kind of shift work. As the demand for services, the globalization of the economies increases, there are more and more professional groups that are expected to work outside the typical 9-to-5 working day. As academics, we are shift workers because we take teleconferences, calls, work outside hours, etc. And so these are some groups that we have worked with before: first responders, healthcare, transport, mining and natural resources, aviation, sports teams, even in extreme environments like Antarctica. We've done studies because they are the people who are overseeing the bases in Antarctica are working shift work. So there are multiple different contexts, and this is increasing. And in the earlier lecture, we talked about the concept of circadian misalignment, which then occurs in shift work. And I just want to make sure that this part of it is really clear to you as well. Remember, we talked about the fact that the concept is that we have a rotating shift schedule in this case, morning shifts afternoon shifts, night shifts. In Australia, that's a very common roster for nurses, for example, that they work in that sort of sequence. And here we have the peak in the melatonin metabolite measured in urine in these shift workers, and you can see on average it remains fairly, it doesn't really shift in its timing. Now there's a huge inter-individual variability, but on average it stays here, which creates this mismatch between what time the circadian clock thinks it is and what time the imposed sleep-wake cycle is trying to achieve. And then I talked about the fact that there are multiple types of misalignment. There's misalignment between the environment and the behavioural schedules that are imposed and the central circadian clock in the SCM. There's misalignment at the cellular level when we talk about the molecular processes that regulate the 24-hour cellular cycle. We see misalignment between multiple oscillators, the SCN oscillator and peripheral oscillators, and between peripheral oscillators. And Dr. Shipra talked about, one paradigm in which that's created, and that is in the jet lag paradigm. So there are multiple different types, all of which underlie the increased risk of disease in shift workers. So we know that in Western economies, the estimate of the number of people who work shift work, what do you think would be a reasonable estimate of how many people that are in the workforce that work shift work would be? Take a guess. What do you think it would be?
Quarter.
A quarter. Any other thoughts? 10%. So the estimate is between 15 and 20. And it's likely to be increasing for a couple of reasons. One is because of this gig economy. Uber drivers, all of these kind of people who are working on demand. And that's a booming industry. The second is because of the fact that we have flexible work arrangements. COVID has driven a rise in flexible work arrangements. People can now work at times that fit in with their lifestyle and so on. And this creates an increase in work outside the traditional office hours. So if we were to look at this again, I think, as Sri said, it may be a quarter, it may be more people that are working some kind of shift work. So as a variable that might explain, if you look at the major health problems that our society faces, impaired cognition, cognitive decline, neurodegeneration, mood disorders, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, really, there is no group of people that that account for major problems facing our society, probably more than shift workers, right? They are exposed to really all of these things that, as a governments are trying to address because of the cost to society of all of these chronic conditions. So they provide, therefore, a very important group of people for us to think about how we're going to target interventions and how we're going to address these problems. And just this came up in the last couple of days as well, is this classification of shift work as a probable carcinogen. And so this was from an update of the IAC committee of the World Health Organization that met in 2019 and confirmed that shift work is a group 2A probable carcinogen. So that means that asbestos, for example, is the highest level, and this is in the next level, probable. And it's based on the epidemiological evidence as well as the animal models that show the increased risk of cancer when you disrupt the circadian clock, when you simulate circadian misalignment, and there is an increased hypothesis that suppression of melatonin at night might be a part of the causal mechanism. So what, and I showed this figure as well, and we have to remember that in shift work, there are multiple things that are going on that may be contributing to increased risk of chronic disease and accidents. So I've been talking about this one, and I'm going to pick up the circadian, because we're in a chronomedicine and chronobiology context here. We're going to be talking about this one in much more detail. But we have to remember that sleep is an independent mechanism through which a number of these risks are also elevated. And in shift workers, separately to the circadian disruption, there's also increased insomnia, obstructive sleep apnea, shift work disorder, all giving rise to sleep disturbance. And then we know, and I talked about this briefly, that there are also increased psychosocial risks. I don't know how many of you have worked shift work, but if you have, you know the stress that it places on families. The fact that you're having meals and all these kinds of things completely out of sync with the rest of the people in your household. And that places increased levels of stress into a domestic situation. And so all of these things, as well as the sedentary lifestyle and all of these conflicts, etc., give rise to stress. So all these factors underlie a number of physiological and psychological mechanisms that expose people to risk of these chronic diseases. Now I'm going to pick up on particularly the circadian disruption. And I talked about, here's another example of the misalignment between the internal circadian clock and the sleep-wake cycle. And this time it's a 12-hour shift. So initially from midday to midnight is the work schedule. And then the group rapidly rotate to night shifts. And you can see that the melatonin rhythm stays on average in the night time. Now, we talked about in the circadian rhythm sleep disorders lecture this disorder called shift work disorder. There's some controversy about, well, is this a disorder? Or is this really normal physiology? Because I've just been talking to you about the fact that we've evolved as a species to be active during the day and sleep during the night. Well, it's probably no surprise that if we try and invert that and impose a schedule that completely opposes our biology, we suffer. But we've called it a disorder because in some people, the response is more severe. And when the response is more severe, it's considered a disorder and therefore the target of treatments, a more clinical kind of focused treatment. And so this is the diagnostic criteria, that there is insomnia and or excessive sleepiness accompanied by a reduction of total sleep time, which is associated with the schedule that usually overlaps with the time for sleep. So that's the key definition, right? That the shift is overlapping the usual time for sleep. It's recurring in its pattern, and that's resulting in a reduction in the total sleep time that the person has, and symptoms of insomnia and excessive sleepiness. Now, there are limited tools to be able to measure whether or not the person has shift work disorder. So we did a study several years ago where we recruited a number of shift workers into a protocol where we wanted to develop a questionnaire screening instrument for shift work disorder. And so the first thing we did was we looked at the scientific literature to look at, well, what's been documented as symptoms of shift work disorder. Then we did focus group interviews with shift workers and sleep physicians to try and understand what their experience of this disorder is. We developed a universal set of questions, and then we administered these questions to a group of shift workers. And separately, we had a sleep physician determine whether or not, based on current diagnostic criteria, whether the person had shift work disorder, whether they met criteria for shift work disorder. And then based on the comparison between this individual's responses to the questionnaire and the clinician's assessment, we then determined the minimal set of questions that best predicted the clinician's diagnosis. A fairly standard way to develop a questionnaire. And these are the 4 questions that ultimately gave the best predictive ability. It wasn't perfect, and that's probably because the clinician's diagnosis is not perfect, because they're also relying on the patient's self-report. But here we have the 4 questions. In the past month, while working non-standard shifts, do you have a problem with waking up too early and not being able to go back to sleep? Sleep is truncated. In the past month, is your sense of well-being impaired? Do you doze off at work? And then the final one, how likely are you to doze off or fall asleep while driving after at least 2 days off from work? The reason that question's included is because if the person continues to be sleepy even after they stop working shift work, then they have sleepiness that's likely to be being caused by another medical or psychiatric or sleep reason, not shift work. Because if you take away the shift work and they're still sleepy, that must mean that there's some other explanation. So this item negatively loads in this questionnaire. So if you are interested in using this questionnaire, you can email Laura Varga or myself, and we can give you, there's a spreadsheet that then you can enter the person's responses and it calculates the risk. And we've used this in hospital settings. And so, for example, and this was a PhD student, Lauren Booker, that worked with Mark Howard and I at a hospital in Melbourne, and we administered this questionnaire to about 200 nurses in the hospital, and we looked, for example, at the relationship between risk of shift work disorder and mood outcomes. And we found that depression severity is increased and anxiety severity is increased in those that have elevated risk of shift work disorder. And this is consistent with the literature that shows they also have increased risk of cardiovascular disease and gastrointestinal disturbances and so on. So it's a useful way to identify those people who may be more vulnerable to the health risks of shift work and be the target of interventions. And to just show you that we think the circadian system may be a critical component in this, this was a study done by Chris Drake and colleagues in the United States, and he divided the individuals that are working nights and the individuals with and without shift work disorder. And those, so asymptomatic night workers is NW and shift work disorder is the SWD. And if you just look at this graph here, you can see what the melatonin rhythm looks like in the asymptomatic night workers, the blue curve, and the shift work disorder individuals. Completely inverted. And so what it's suggesting is that the asymptomatic night workers appear to have good circadian adaptation. The shift work disorder individuals have poor adaptation. The melatonin rhythm is at a completely adverse phase, suggesting that the circadian clock may be an important part of the mechanism for why some people have more severe response to shift work. Here is another example, a beautiful illustration of the way in which shift work may cause this elevated risk. This was a forced desynchrony study done by Frank Shear at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I've mentioned to a few of you Frank Shear's work, and I think it will be of strong interest to you because Frank has been doing work over many years linking a number of cardiometabolic outcomes to disturbances in the circadian clock and in sleep. And so he has done these beautiful studies showing clear evidence of these associations. And I know a number of you are interested in those variables. But here's an example of, firstly, the imposition of a shift work, a simulated shift work schedule, and how that impacts our appetite regulation. Leptin is an appetite regulating hormone that that controls your hunger levels. And here, so he used a forced desynchrony protocol, and you remember from my discussion a few days ago, the forced desynchrony protocol, every day they were put onto a 28-hour schedule, so every day the sleep-wake cycle is shifted 4 hours each day. So they start off aligned with the sleep-wake cycle, aligned to the circadian clock. By day 3 or 4, the circadian clock is completely misaligned from the sleep-wake cycle. And so there's full circadian misalignment, and that's what we would expect in a night shift worker. And what he demonstrated is that there is a suppression, a significant suppression of the hormone leptin in those conditions. So here's the baseline of what happened when they were normally aligned, and here's what happens when they're misaligned, the big suppression of leptin, which would predict lower satiety and therefore increased appetite. And that may explain why one of the mechanisms for why there is an increased risk of obesity in shift workers. Frank also looked at the postprandial regulation of glucose, postprandial metabolic response. And he found that in this protocol, these are super healthy people, right? To qualify for these studies, it's like you need to be an Olympic athlete to be able to come into the lab, be super healthy, no risk factors for any of these conditions. But yet, within a few days, when they were in the aligned state, that is the normal day working, to when they went to misaligned, remember it's only 3 days later, some of them, 3 of them, had already entered a pre-diabetic state in terms of their glucose response. And one of them could be categorized as diabetic in just 3 days. And so that shows you a direct causal effect of the misalignment in the circadian clock and the impact on this metabolic changes in glucose regulation. So we have also done similar work looking at a group of shift workers and looking at their cognitive and alertness responses. So this was a study done by Suzanne Fortuny when she was in our group. And so we took a group of 22 shift workers, we measured the melatonin rhythm of this group of night shift workers. And here is just the spectrum of the timing of the melatonin rhythm in these shift workers. And you can see that it's a huge range. It's a 12-hour range, really. Some people here at 0, some people here, all the way across. up to 12 noon. A massive variance in the range of circadian time.
Does it depend on the duration of the shift work?
It didn't. And I'll tell you in a moment what it actually depends on, because we've done the studies where we've tracked people that are going from day work into the same night shift schedule and looking at the factors that predict this variance. So what we found was that those people who are working at an adverse circadian phase, if their clock hasn't adapted well, measures of alertness and performance are significantly impaired. And we use this kind of technology called OptAlert, which is made in Melbourne, and it's a pair of glasses that has infrared oculography, and so it has like an infrared sensor in the pair of glasses, and it measures the velocity and amplitude of eyelid movements and algorithm, because the ocular motor system is one of the earliest indicators of sleepiness, eyelid changes. And so it uses these very sensitive changes in the velocity and amplitude of eyelid movements to be able to detect objectively how sleepy a person is. So it's used, for example, in truck drivers and so on, to be able to continuously monitor someone's alertness state or sleepiness state. And so we use that kind of technology to objectively monitor the person's sleepiness levels. And we find that those who are misaligned when they work shift work are more objectively sleepy. We've also done these studies in nurses and doctors in a hospital where we track them over time to be able to measure their sleep, when they sleep while they work shift work, and also the timing of their melatonin rhythms. So this is a doctor that was working shifts in the hospital. The grey bars are their sleep and the white are their work shifts. And this is a nurse showing the kind of the changes in their shift schedule and then how their sleep accommodates or is accommodated when they're working shifts. And these diamonds represent the melatonin acrophase measured at various points of the protocol. And when we do this study in a large group and we monitor what happens when they work day shifts, the first night shift in a sequence and the final night shift in a sequence, here is the performance and the alertness levels measured on a scale called the Karolinska Sleepiness Scale. I mentioned the psychomotor vigilance task in an earlier lecture. That's one of the common measures that can be used, and so this was all done in a hospital setting, in an ICU. You can give them a computerized task to perform while they're on a break on shift, right? So this was all done in the operational setting, not in the lab. And you can measure clearly what happens, firstly during the day shift in terms of their performance levels. So you've got low levels of sleepiness, good fast reaction times, and minimal lapses of attention. As they work night shifts, they start off well, but their alertness levels rapidly decline. So increased sleepiness levels, increased reaction time, and increased lapses of attention. And you can see that here is 0 is the circadian acrophase, the worst time in terms of the circadian clock. And as you get closer and closer to that time, performance is significantly impaired. So it shows the impact of the biology in an operational setting. What happens when they drive home? So this was a study that Megan Mulhall did in an emergency department in a hospital. And what we did was, you see, the reason it's shown in a three-dimensional graph is because there are two factors that influence alertness. One is the duration of time the person's been awake, the homeostatic process. and one is the circadian process. So often in the sleep field, we show this in a three-dimensional plot because there is an interaction between the two. So here is the time relative to circadian phase, which is the circadian process, and here is the duration the person has been awake. And what Megan did was that in this part of the study, she looked at, as they got into their car after the working of their shift, she asked them on a validated scale how sleepy they are. And she plotted this according to their circadian phase and how long they've been awake for. And you can see that as they are awake for longer, the sleepiness level increases, and that's why you're seeing the orange and yellow as they are awake for longer. And as they're at an adverse circadian phase, it's the worst. It's extremely high. This is a 9-point scale, right? The Karolinska sleepiness scale. That is the worst you could get. And you're getting people who are getting into their cars after working a night shift and about to drive home, and they're at their sleepiest. So this was relating to the question of what causes this difference between individuals. So this was a study done by Julia Stone in our group. And so what she did was she measured each of these circles represent, triangles represent the peak melatonin level measured in an individual shift worker. So this is one person, this is another person, and so on. Firstly measured when they're working day shifts, then they transition into night shifts, and then she measured them again after 3 or 4 night shifts. And she looked at where each person went in terms of their phase. And you can see that some people have gone later in time, they've delayed. Some people have gone earlier in time, they've advanced. And if we put everyone onto 0 at baseline, you can see the majority of people delayed, but some people advanced. And there's quite a big spread in terms of the phase change or phase shift due to the same imposed shift schedule. So we were interested in what caused these massive inter-individual differences. And so we used the phase response curve to light, because we had a hypothesis that maybe it has something to do with the way that the individual is interacting with light. So we used the actigraph to record light information. We used a mathematical approach to be able to see, all right, well, where does light fall relative to the phase response curve in each individual? And what would that predict? And using that algorithm, we found that the difference in the distribution of light relative to the phase response curve, combined with their diurnal preference, their chronotype. So we input as predictors chronotype and light, the phase at which light was seen by the individual. And this accounted for 71% of this variability. I think you'll agree, I mean, that's a fairly big proportion of the variance that we can explain with just 2 variables, diurnal preference and their light exposure.
What do you mean by diurnal preference?
The chronotype, morningness, eveningness. So we know from that morningness, eveningness is driven by a number of endogenous variables as well as lifestyle-driven variables. So
this PRC is of not that individual, this is
general phase response curve. And a really good question, because if we had the individual's PRC, we could probably account for even more of the variance, because there are differences in light sensitivity between individuals. Right? So this is really promising because it can tell us now, well, we can explain most of this by a combination of your trait-like variable, your chronotype, and your environmental light exposure. Now we it's more difficult to change the trait, but variable, it's possible to change.
Are you going to correlate with the jet lag in the lecture? Or
We haven't done it with jet lag. We haven't done the same experiment with jet lag.
I mean, the reason I'm asking because the thumb rule is whether you fly eastward or westward. And the old rule is that you adjust by an hour per day.
Yes.
And if your melatonin rhythm remains intact during the daytime, then you are not going to have a good night's sleep even if you're there for, let's say, 7 days.
So my expectation is that the same finding will hold true for jet lag. It'll be a similar group. It'll be a combination of your endogenous kind of, your tau and so on, your free running period, which is reflected in the chronotype, and your environmental light exposure that explains how quickly you adjust your jet lag as well.
Is there a dissociation between melatonin rhythm and adjustment in your other peripheral clocks? Because consistently you're presenting the data that melatonin stays almost at the same phase even after a week of
In shift workers,
Yeah,
because
in
of
shift
the
work.
competing light cues. In jet lag, it shifts. We, in humans, have not been able to measure peripheral rhythms well. That's the problem. Aakansha, this microphone, I don't mind, but the microphones aren't working. This one. Okay, so this was an important study, and we're continuing to take this forward. And I'm going to now just spend a few minutes telling you about what can we do about this. What are some of the things that we can do to help shift workers? Because we've demonstrated how terrible the problem is. We've understood the physiology reasonably well. So what are we going to do about it? So I'm summarizing some work that was done as a part of a collaborative center between Monash University, the Institute for Breathing and Sleep in Austin Hospital, the University of Sydney, and Flinders University in Adelaide. And this involved a group of participants, and this was a centre in which a whole lot of industry partners come together with academic partners and government partners to be able to solve a major societal challenge. And so we put forward the case to the government that we need a centre to tackle the problems of shift work. So it was a 7-year centre, and these are the partners that came together. And so I want to quickly go through some of the solutions that were developed by this centre, which has just completed its work. So the first thing that we did was we looked at, well, one of the difficulties we have is that we can't reliably and accurately measure in shift workers easily how sleepy the person is. So we could ask the person, but it's difficult to actually objectively and reliably measure it. And you can imagine if you ask a truck driver how sleepy you are, or a doctor how sleepy you are, it's going to be very much influenced by the pressure that they have around them. And it's hard when you are in the emergency room to say, look, I'm too sleepy, I'm going to go home, when there's a huge patient load waiting for you. So we decided that we really needed to focus a whole research program on the discovery of biomarkers of alertness or sleepiness. And we were interested in those that respond to acute sleep deprivation, immediate changes in how your alertness changes the longer you've been awake. Chronic sleep deprivation, which is what Sean Drummond talked to you about over long periods of time, the accumulation of inadequate sleep, and your circadian timing. And we wanted to measure these potentially at the biological level, neurophysiological, EEG, EOG type variables, and also behavioral biomarkers. And I showed you earlier that Claire Anderson, for example, has looked at some metabolites, used a metabolomic discovery approach to be able to classify certain metabolites in blood as markers of acute sleep loss, chronic sleep loss, and circadian phase. We also worked on the fact that it's well and good to tell you now how sleepy the person is, but could I measure in any of you now how sleepy you are and make a prediction in 8 hours about how sleepy you will be? Because that's going to be really useful to forecast, because if you are coming into work, I want to know how sleepy you are now, but I also want to know how that's going to change over time. So we use predictive models, and for those of you who are in mathematical modeling, for example, at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, a model was developed of sleep and circadian timing called the Chronobiology model, which is a dynamic model of the human circadian clock and how it responds to light. Andrew Phillips and Peter Robinson at the University of Sydney included a homeostatic component. We brought the two together and we developed a kind of a framework for a biomathematical model that takes work and sleep times as well as light-dark information and puts it into this model, and it gives you predictions of alertness, sleep, and circadian timing in the future. And Svetlana Postnova from the University of Sydney did that work. And we've now programmed that into an API that can then interact with software. So you can, for example, develop, use an app that, for example, for jet lag, like Vinod was saying, that then calls the API to be able to then make predictions to then inform some kind of intervention that you want to use in a digital application. We also recognized that sleepiness was a major factor, and sleep disorders are a major factor in shift workers. And we needed to address those as an underlying cause of these health risks. So this was a study we did when I was in the United States, and it was with 5,000 US police officers. And each of those blue dots represents one police officer. And when I screened them for 5 common sleep disorders, obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, shift work disorder, restless leg syndrome, and narcolepsy, we found that 40% screened positive for at least one of the 5 sleep disorders. An enormously high percentage of or prevalence of these disorders. And it perhaps shouldn't have been surprising, because if we look at the BMI, the age group, etc., these are high-risk individuals, coupled with the fact that they're working shift work. These are the prevalence rates of the various disorders. So obstructive sleep apnea, 33.6%, a third of them exactly, screened positive for obstructive sleep apnea, and 6.5 for moderate to severe insomnia, and 14.5 for shift work disorder. And the majority of them didn't know, so 15.1% of those who screened positive for obstructive sleep apnea reported knowing or having received a diagnosis. 85% had no knowledge that they had this disorder. And we looked at the relationship between having the disorder or being at risk of a sleep disorder and a number of health outcomes when you correct for all the other risk factors that we could have corrected for, adjusting for age, sex, BMI, hypertension, cigarette smoking, alcohol, etc. We find that those who have a risk of obstructive sleep apnea have significantly elevated risk of diabetes, depression, burnout, falling asleep while driving, cardiovascular disease, anxiety, and so on. So all of these things are elevated in those that carry this undiagnosed, untreated risk of sleep disorders. So what did we do about it? Well, we developed a screening instrument that could be done online to identify the risk of all of these common sleep complaints, classifies people into these various sleep health buckets, and then provides them with resources and information about those disorders. And so we work closely with Philips, that then disseminated this tool widely, and it's freely available so that people can go in, log in, and see whether they have a risk of any of these disorders. We also knew that rostering is at the moment largely done based on the logistics of the organisation, how many doctors are needed to be on shift, rather than, and people's preferences, rather than the biology of people's circadian and sleep systems. So we worked with rostering software companies to be able to input the model of the sleep system to try and reduce the circadian disruption in shift work rosters, the schedules that people work, to make it more sleep friendly. And so, for example, the first thing we did was we brought together an expert group that included the regulators, the unions, and so on in a healthcare environment. And we developed a whole lot of principles about how people in healthcare should be rostered. We looked at the European Union and so on to see what are the rules in the way in which shift workers are being rostered. And then we worked with this company of Opturian. Opturian does already the logistics of work scheduling. So they do for the airline industry and hospitals and so on. And we inputted these work hour guidelines and fatigue modeling into their software. And so an example of one of the projects that Opturian then conducted was in Australia. There's a major project, or in Melbourne, there's a major project going on where there are accidents constantly being caused by rail crossings. So where the railway needs to cross roads, there are major accidents being caused with cars that are stopping on the railway line. So the government has been trying to eliminate all of these rail crossings, level rail crossings, by making them underpasses. And so in that process, it's a massive construction challenge. People are working like months and months on end, night shift, to try and do all of this construction. So we used the rostering system because people were working 12, 13-hour shifts followed by 2 days off, causing significant health issues, burnout, mental health risks, etc. So using this particular software, we were able to change the roster completely so that we reduced the number of consecutive shifts from 12 to 6, for example. We changed the 2-shift to a 3-shift system with an 8-hour night shift and a 10-hour morning and afternoon shift to make them, because it has the fatigue model with it, it makes it less disruptive to the sleep and circadian systems.
So what is the duration of each shift? That is 1 week or 15 days?
What is the duration of
Each shift.
each shift? So it was previously 12 hours, and it went to either 8 or 10. 8 overnight.
No, it is for 1 week or for 15 days.
6 days. 6 consecutive. It used to be 12, and it went to 6. And then the final thing is, and this came from, just to give you an illustration, I remember once I was going to a conference in the United States, and I was with a colleague of mine in the flight, and the air hostess came and said to both of us, "You're a professor. You're both professors. What do you profess? What's your area?" And my colleague, I never say that I'm in sleep. I don't know about my colleagues in the back of the room here, but I never say sleep, because as soon as you say that, people then tell you all about their sleep problems. I didn't say anything, and my colleague said, "I'm a professor of sleep medicine." And so this air hostess said, "Oh my goodness, I've got so many." And then she came and sat next to us, and she started telling us about all the problems. And she is taking, and it's really sad because she's taking this cocktail of all these antidepressants and stimulants and everything to cope with the work that she's doing. And yet, I asked her the simple question, when do you sleep? And her sleep was so poor. She said that when she gets to, we were actually going to Hawaii, and she said, when I get to Honolulu, I said, what do you do in Honolulu? I do shopping, I do surfing, I do this, I do that. And then I realized we could do all we can to improve the conditions, but if people aren't well educated, they don't have good health literacy, there's only so much we can improve people's health. And so we decided that we needed to develop a tool that actually supports the individual by getting them to manage their own sleep as well. So we developed a digital application that basically takes those principles that I covered yesterday about how to manage shift work and automates it into an app. So you input your work schedule, and it gives you, using the biomathematical model that I talked about earlier, an optimal sleep schedule. And it helps the shift worker to plan then, because they should be planning prospectively when to sleep. They should be telling their families, I'm going to be sleeping from this time to this time, and plan their meals and everything accordingly. And so that's what this particular app has been developed for. And we've trialed it in a hospital environment, and we've looked at impacts on mental health, for example, in those that use this app. And we find positive changes in mental health. I'll just go for another 5 minutes to finish lighting, and then I'm happy to take a break for questions. So the last thing is the environment. How can we change the physical environment to make it more conducive to health in shift working environments? And so we already know that lighting is the major environmental cue for adaptation of the circadian system, and secondly, it has a direct alerting effect. So there are potential benefits for shift workers if we can manipulate the lighting. And we know now about the properties of the circadian clock in terms of how it responds to light. And this was a review written several years ago by Steve Lockley and Josh Gooley that documented the developments 15 years ago in the discovery of the melanopsin system and this separate photoreceptor mechanism that was contained in these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that are maximally responsive to short wavelength light, unlike the classic photoreceptor system that goes to that supports the visual aspects of our functioning, which are maximally sensitive to this kind of mid-wavelength range, green light. And so we understand quite a bit now about at least the melanopsin system and how it responds to light. Increasingly now we know that these systems interact. It's not just that the melanopsin system controls all of the circadian responses. We know that the systems interact quite a bit. That's why a number of you asked, well, can we develop a lighting system that only impacts the circadian system or doesn't impact the circadian system? Nothing in physiology is that black and white. So there are clear interactions between the systems, and so you can't. If there's light, it's likely to be impacting the circadian system. So we developed, for example, we tested some of these lighting interventions in shift workers. So we looked at a Philips product that is enhanced in short wavelength, in the short wavelength range. The blue indicates the increased intensity in the short wavelength range. And when we tested this in a randomized controlled trial in shift workers, firstly we thought, there is no difference between the two light conditions, the blue enriched and the standard light, if we look at their sleepiness levels across the night. And we wondered why this was. And then we realized that actually it's only when we test the effect of the intervention according to the circadian phase that we see the difference. So when you administer the light intervention at the adverse circadian phase, we see a significant reduction in sleepiness levels. Excuse me. So Tracy Sletton has tested a similar intervention in a chemical plant. We've taken a light intervention into a chemical plant, and we've looked at whether it will improve reaction time and sleepiness levels, and indeed it does in these workers. And I've been a part of a Cochrane review that has looked at even day workers, whether short wavelength light and lighting interventions can improve the alertness levels. Ultimately, we only looked at 2 studies because they were so limited in terms of what demonstrates sufficient quality, but there was a positive signal.
So these were lab-based studies, or these are natural conditions?
Natural conditions. So the ones that are lab-based, so firstly, this one was lab-based. We brought real shift workers into the lab, and we tested the lighting intervention in the lab. Then this study was in the operational setting, in the workplace. And then this Cochrane review was done of studies that have tested lighting interventions in the workplace. So Steve Lockley, as a part of the work of this centre, worked with a lighting design company, because how do you do this in practice? Lighting designers, if someone's building a hospital or someone's building a school, often they'll bring in lighting designers as a part of the team of architects and so on. So Steve worked with a lighting design company to be able to input the circadian neuroscience into the lighting design, so that when they model what the lighting environment is going to be like in a room like this, it has melanopic lux as a part of the considerations of whether there's adequate lighting. And then we also want to be able to give lighting products as well. Those that are enriched with short wavelengths, those that are depleted of short wavelengths. And so Sean Kane worked as a part of this centre with a company called Versalux, that is an LED manufacturing company that produced this product range called Melogen that has blue enriched, and then it has blue depleted light sources as well, so that you can use lights in, for example, residential settings that promote alertness at particular times and reduce alertness close to sleep. And all of this can be found on this website called the Work Alert website. There's a lot of information there where you can see summaries of all of these things that have been developed. So I'm going to stop there and thank all of the teams that have contributed to the work that I've presented, and I'm happy to, actually before we take a break, what do you think, international faculty? Shall we? All right, so we would like to, as it's coming close to our last lectures, we would like to express our gratitude to the organisers of this wonderful program.
I have a query.
Oh, before you say your query, could I just think about your query just for a couple of minutes and I'll come to you. So I would like to invite our wonderful international faculty to come up, and I'd like to invite the organisers, Professor Verma, Professor Vinod, Kumar, and Aakansha to come up as well. And we have just something small to say thank you. There you are. So, on behalf of all of us, I would like to express our gratitude to the organisers of the program as well. Thank you.
From your
We need to get photographed. Okay.
Documentation.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to take your question, and then would you like to take?
Rotational shift work, irregular shift work, and which kind of shift work is more worse than the other?
Really great question. What type of shift work is worse? There are several dimensions of shift work that are backed, right, that are worse. There's a review written by Folkard, Folkard, and his name is Simon, so first initial is S, and the other author is Tucker, Tucker, and he's Philip, so P. What they did was they examined the rate of industrial accidents in a huge database, and they looked at which aspects of shift structures predicted the worst responses. And in summary, they find that as the duration of the shift increases, especially as it increases beyond 12 hours, there's a marked increase in the rate of accidents and injuries. When the rotation of the shift is slow, so that is after 4 or 5 consecutive shifts, there's a marked increase in the rate of accidents. When the rotation is backward, so do we know what backward means, rotation? It means that it's... Sorry?
After night shift, they again start after night, then morning, then afternoon, then morning.
Correct. So it's going night, afternoon, morning. And that is causing a challenge to the circadian system because it's causing the system to have to phase advance, whereas most people's clocks phase delay. So forward rotation is better. That is night, morning, afternoon. So I would look at that paper by Folkard and Tucker because it documents the magnitude of increased risk with all of the different aspects of shift schedules.
How will we overcome with that problem? I mean, shift work.
How do we overcome it?
Overcome.
It's a matter of, because we've accepted that it's something that's here to stay, I think we all agree that there are essential services
Because
that
it is a demand of time.
exactly. We need to manage it well.
I think chronotype play an important role.
It definitely
Reduce
does.
the risk of
Yeah.
due to shift work.
And so one way could be that we look at people's chronotype as they're recruited into shift work, and we then schedule them accordingly.
But majority of them were middle one that neither type is because.
And so if they're neither type, then they
can
could
fluctuate.
then they could be more flexible. Whereas what we don't want to do is to take the morning types and continuously put them on night shift.
Worse in extreme types.
Yeah. And so all of the tools that I showed, I don't think there's a single solution. That's why, as a centre, we developed all of those things. Because what we wanted to do was to give organisation all of the tools that they can manage the problem at an individual level, at a group, and at an environmental level. Correct.
Just intuitively, in terms of the timing of shifts, the rotation is a factor predicting poor outcomes. Surely, just intuitively, working out shift time and generally doing mornings or generally doing afternoons or generally doing evenings, from sleep and circadian perspective, surely stability of timing of the shift would be our starting point, and the whole notion that you would rotate times seems bizarre, except from some weird sort of moralistic idea that nights are worse and everyone has to have a crack at night shift. I would have thought as soon as you start to think about sleep and circadian, the obvious starting point would be stable shifts, not rotating shifts.
So, Greg, that is theoretically exactly the position we started with. But we find that human beings, if you put someone onto a permanent night shift roster, they're very bad at, that would work well if all aspects of their life were inverted to deal with the permanent night shifts. But they don't do that well, because their family and social and other commitments cause them to have to either revert back to day shift, day active patterns when they're on days off, or even do both while they're working night shifts. And that causes this exposure. And so a number of studies have now shown that if you're on a long sequence of nights, the risk gets greater and greater rather than less and less. If you think theoretically that you've adapted the circadian clock and therefore the risk should be reducing, but it doesn't. And we think that's the reason. And the second point is that, I forgot the second, what was the second point that you made? Oh, stability. We do know that I've participated in a lot of medico-legal cases where there's been an accident and they bring an expert in a court case to testify as to whether this accident was caused by fatigue or not. One of the most common things I see is the lack of stability or the lack of predictability causes a big challenge to the individual. If you're working night shifts and you're only learning whether you're on a shift or not with 24 to 48 hours notice, it's very difficult to plan. And it's very difficult to accommodate all these changes in your behaviour if it's just changing because the organisation's telling you, quick, we need someone to come in. And unfortunately, it just happens all the time in hospitals because they're forever having to change their schedules. And that causes a big impact on the individual for the inability to plan a week in advance what their schedule is going to be. Yes?
Sir, can we have one person for morning shift, one person for afternoon shift, and 2 person for night shift with alternate night off?
Yes, that's a good principle to start with. Morning shifts turn out to be quite bad in terms of the risks as well. And it depends on when the morning shifts start. I don't know typically when a hospital morning shift starts in India. What's a typical? Around 8. Okay, so that's a little better. In our hospitals in Melbourne.
But in police, it is start around 6
In-
a.m. In police department.
Police
Shift
departments.
work.
Yeah. So those early starts, so in our hospitals, the typical morning shift for nurses and doctors is at 7. 7 causes quite a bit of circadian rhythm disruption. 6 would be even worse and cause restriction of sleep. 8 is better. So that's why the only thing is we found in our studies that morning shifts are really quite detrimental as well. So maybe you need to accommodate that in your plan as well.
Very silly question. When you were saying that with shift work it gets worse, like if you continue to do it, how is it different from when I'm trying to phase reset a person with a delayed sleep disorder and I'm trying to give them melatonin therapy and bright light therapy, I'm trying to, as opposed to a shift worker who's also trying to shift his schedule and put him into a...
Great question. So, I would say fundamentally it's the same problem. It's a mismatch between the schedule that the person wants to keep and what their circadian clock is signaling. The problem is much more complicated for the shift worker because often it's the shift schedule is changing. So it's not simply a matter of changing the circadian clock to adapt, because once you do that, you're changing again. And so it's a constantly changing process, and so it's quite complex to develop the intervention. In a delayed sleep wake state, you try and shift the clock to adjust to the desired sleep schedule. And that's a more constant intervention that you're trying to implement.
One more thing. So you did show that after 3 days of the shift work schedule, you see a change in the glucose. So basically there was some pre-diabetic and diabetic.
You should carefully look at the person's food timing and the content of the food. Because if there's elevated, if there's impaired glucose regulation, you should be looking at low GI foods and all of these things, that there should be a specific diet for shift workers, because if they're going to have to eat at an adverse circadian phase, and so there's a group in our university in the nutrition and dietetics department that have a grant where they're developing a diet and testing a diet for shift workers to try and reduce some of the adverse triglyceride and glucose response.
From our bird work, we have demonstrated that the rhythm in melatonin follows the feeding rhythm and the activity history. So would it be wise insect worker, for instance, to adopt this where the feeding time is not distant, the meal times are not distant, but their work time changes.
So to not just repeat that,
So the meal time is not shifted according to the work schemes.
Yeah.
So that the melatonin rhythm, just gets better shifted. Because, we demonstrated that when, it goes with the feeding melatonin rather than activity. Activity less set. So if you have a...
I would have thought, even though we haven't measured it well in humans, I would have thought that the feeding cycle is going to shift the peripheral clocks, the liver clock and so on, whereas the light dark is going to be the critical variable for the SCN and therefore the melatonin.
Yeah, that's what we thought when we did the study. But when we released, we had the circadian activity, circadian pattern, and we found that it goes well with the melatonin.
Well, I think,
with the feeding,
yeah.
rather than the melatonin. Rather than the activity.
I mean, that kind of discovery in an animal model or in a bird model is really important, because we have done quite a lot to try and manage the productivity, safety, alertness impairments in shift workers. We're trying to do as much as we can, but we don't know what to do about the other chronic diseases like diabetes and so on. And part of that is that we haven't developed the interventions. So I think we need to rely on, and that's probably going to be the next phase of research that's going to be done, is to rely on what we understand in these models to be able to try and implement them.
From personal interaction with few colleagues, I know for sure that what they do before planning the journey, or time zones, they adjust their meal time.
They adjust their meal time.
And they have very less problem of jet lag when they arrive.
Yeah.
And they are not in majority in number, but with personal interaction, they, before they start, I don't do it, but they do it, and they always advise me, why, when you're flying to London, why don't you, have your meal time according to London time, at least one day in advance.
Yes, yes.
And you will better adjust it. So you skip a meal or something so that you can get.
I mean, if you are working, if you're about to go into a long sequence of night shifts, for example, you should follow a similar principle. The problem is that if it's rapidly rotating, it makes it.
Yeah, but on one hand, you suggest that the short duration rotation is better, but on the other hand, you give very little time to adjust to your circadian system to your time zone. Because
But that's because, very few people actually adjust their circadian system when they're exposed to a long sequence. Because they're just poor at changing their behavior. You're talking about colleagues that are motivated to adjust, right, and understand the whole biology.
Would it be useful to provide short names when the sleep pressure high in night shift workers?
To provide short-term?
Naps.
Yes,
Nap medication.
yes. So short-term naps, who was talking about? Sean Drummond was talking about short-term naps. I completely agree with him that short-term naps should be seen as, so there are two uses of naps in shift workers. One is as a strategy to prepare for shift work. So if you woke up this morning, let's say at 7 o'clock in the morning, and you have a night shift tonight, one of the reasons that the first night shift is dangerous is because you've already been awake for 16 hours or 15 hours when you're even starting the night shift. So that means your homeostatic sleep pressure is already going to be high when you're even starting the night shift. So therefore, a nap before you start the night shift helps to reduce some of that homeostatic sleep pressure before you start. The second use of a nap in shift work is to offset some of the sleepiness to give you a boost in your alertness and productivity during the shift. And more it's becoming, there was this theory, or there was this feeling in occupational settings that why am I paying someone to sleep? Why are we having napping in our workplace? But as Sean said, Google and other companies have recognized that if you provide these facilities, you get a boost in people's alertness, productivity, etc. And so, certainly in shift working environments, I think there's a place for that kind of an approach. In day workers, I think we should look at why it is that people are having to have naps, because their overnight sleep may be inadequate or there may be an underlying sleep disorder. So in shift workers, both of those napping strategies have been shown to be beneficial.
Just an academic question. So in circadian biology, one of the hypotheses is that if you play with the melatonin rhythm, you change the flexibility of the circadian system to resynchronize faster. Now, if you have some way of reducing the amplitude of melatonin rhythm, we think that that would be better for the shift worker, without much consequences on the other health parameters which probably melatonin is involved in.
So I know the literature you're talking about, and for example, in rats, if you pinealectomize the rat, you abolish the melatonin rhythm, you can cause more rapid retraining. Because probably the melatonin rhythm serves as this internal signal of time that you're abolishing, and the animal then can more rapidly adjust to the new time zone. And presumably that came from the bird. Yeah, okay. In humans, the only demonstration I've seen of this that I'm aware of is in phase resetting, in the phase response curve. If you hit the time of temperature minimum, for example, with a light pulse, you can cause a you can substantially reduce the amplitude of the circadian oscillation as measured by temperature, and then induce these massive phase shifts, right? These type 0 reset. That's the only example that I've seen. I haven't seen manipulation of the melatonin rhythm in humans to be able to do this.
So let me put it in another way. Is there a seasonal pattern in the melatonin rhythms in human as far as the amplitude and duration is concerned.
Tom Weir
Yeah.
did these beautiful studies in the NIH in the United States because, as you may be aware, the melatonin rhythm is a signal for day length, right? So in seasonal breeding animals, as the day length changes due to season, the duration of melatonin secretion changes, and there's ample evidence to suggest that that is the internal sort of cue for physiological processes to adjust to seasons. So there was a hypothesis in humans that maybe we are seasonal as well. And so Tom Weir tested, but we've overridden the seasonal changes because Greg Murray said, because we have artificial light and all of these things that really override the natural seasonal variations in light, and therefore we're not getting an endogenous seasonal variation anymore because our environment is now very different. So Tom Weir tested that by keeping people in a light-dark cycle that was a winter photoperiod. So he brought people in, I think what they did was they went out during the day and went to work, and then they came back and they got into the lab by 6 p.m. and went into darkness for 14 hours, into a winter photoperiod. And he found a lengthening of the melatonin profile in these people. And he found a lengthening, and he found some bimodal as well, melatonin distribution, which suggested, I think the interpretation was maybe this was suggesting the dual oscillator. That's the only evidence that I've seen of, in humans, a photoperiodic response.
I mean, to put it directly, is there a difference between winter and summer in adapting to a set work pattern? I mean, did you ever notice?
We have been asked, in newsrooms to analyse whether there's been a seasonal difference, and we've never found one. Now, we've never tested it specifically, but we've never found one. Macular degeneration and retinal cell damage, right, yeah. So we ensure that the light products that we're using have gone through a testing process. So we use someone in the United States that looks at the kind of, just does a hazard analysis for us to make sure that the wavelength distribution and the intensity have, the predicted risk of retinal cell damage. It can be the entire day. It can be, depends on the intervention. Some of them are, because like some of them, if we're doing photobiological experiments, we put people into what they call a Gansfeld dome, so that we can put their head into a dome, because we want to measure the light dose carefully and administer it carefully. In those exposures, it can be 1 hour, it can be 6 hours, they can sit in the dome. But we always calibrate the intensity and wavelength composition according to this safety analysis that's being done, a hazard analysis. The second thing we do is we get often, if we're directly administering light, quite often we get an ophthalmologist or an optician to examine the eye before and after the exposure, and we never find any retinal damage. So specifically, 480 nanometers is the one that, that wavelength appears to be what the human melanopsin system is maximally sensitive to. So around that 460 to 480 is where you'll get the maximum sensitivity, which is in the visible spectrum of light, in the short kind of blue range. So So if you look at light in that nanometer range, it will look blue, but you can't give people blue light and expect them to function. So that's why people use blue enriched white light, so that people can tolerate it. Any other questions? All right, I think we should break for a... Oh, yes, Sri.
Melatonin receptor antagonist, would it be a good experiment to do? See,
It would be an excellent experiment. So Sri's question is, could we use melatonin receptor antagonists?
just for re-entry.
Yes, it would be an excellent opportunity for us to do the kinds of things that Vinod was talking about, to kind of shut off the melatonin signal.
You think melatonin could be one of the ways in which peripheral organs are entrained?
Is melatonin...
Could be one of the ways in
Yes.
which peripheral organs entrained, given they all have MP1 and 2 receptors.
Yes, so there is a strong hypothesis that melatonin could be the internal chemical signal that supports communication from the central circadian pacemaker in the SCN to the peripheral organs. So, Sri, I'm very interested in talking to you about it because when I've talked to pharmaceutical companies about the development of the melatonin antagonists, they're skeptical about whether they can do it because there are very few preclinical studies that have really advanced with melatonin antagonists.
You mean they don't have the preclinical data?
That doesn't progress very much from their in vitro into in vivo for whatever reasons.
Okay. But you know, okay.
We should talk about that. Anything else before we close? All right, thank you everyone for your attention, and we'll have tea.
So let us once more officially thank Professor Rajaratnam for his lectures, and let's just give him a round of applause. Thank you, sir. And I invite you all for the tea outside, and I want everybody to assemble back at 11.